You're listening to the Higher Calling Podcast. I'm Pete Newsome, and I'm joined today by Ricky Baez once again, and we are your source for all things hiring, staffing, and recruiting. Ricky, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Pete. It's a beautiful week, beautiful month. Happy.
Football season. We're in Florida. My Seminoles are doing great. It's a happy time.
Not if you're a New York fan, right? You got the Bills, you got the Jets, and you have the Giants who all disappointed their fans in the same field in 24 hours. So I don't know about that.
Well, sorry for that, but it's college football here in Florida, Ricky. So
Yeah, that's true.
we don't care about that stuff up north.
You got it.
But what we do care about is something that is on, unfortunately, too many people's mind today, which is interviewing. And while we like when people are getting new jobs, new opportunities for the right reasons, unfortunately, there's a lot of people looking on the market, not by choice right now. Kind of a crazy time out there, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely, because there is a wealth of information, and whether that information is good or bad is really hard to decipher. And that's where we're here to make sure you get the right information when you go out to start interviewing people, and just starting to make sure you find the right talent for your organization. So we are here, Pete, to set the record straight.
There's a lot of seasoned, experienced candidates on the market, and sometimes they have to interview with new managers, new recruiters, people who don't have the same level of experience. So, interview training is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about how to conduct a successful interview, what should be on your mind, what you should think about, especially if you're new as an interviewer. It's an important thing to understand.
Absolutely. It definitely is. Just how a candidate has to prepare for this interview, the interviewer has to prepare in the same manner for a different type of an approach. So absolutely. So the role of the interviewer, Pete. What it's so a lot of people step into this role, into the managerial, whether it's a recruiter or whether it's somebody who it's the hiring authority, they step into that role and they start to get nervous, right? I mean, do you remember the first time you had to interview? How nervous were you?
I was very nervous, and I do remember it because I was 23 years old. I was recently out of school, my first recruiting job, and I had to interview someone who was older than my father, and that was
Oh, wow.
really intimidating for me until and it was for a while. It stayed that way as a young professional until I realized it wasn't about my age. It was about how I presented myself, how I conducted the interview session. And so as I became comfortable with that and had confidence that I knew what to do, the age sort of fell away. It wasn't a factor, but yeah, early on it was intimidating.
I remember the first time I interviewed for human resources, and the interviewer was more nervous than I was, and I sweat. Pete, when I'm on the spot, I sweat. They were sweating like crazy. So what we're going to talk about here is give those interviewers the confidence to know the different steps they need to take to make sure that they create a really good experience for the candidate. So let's get going.
Yeah,
Let's
I
see what we
mean,
got.
look, you represent your company and yourself, that brand. I mean, how you behave and act and you treat that individual is going to resonate then and later on down the road. The person is going to remember. So even if they're a great candidate, if you don't conduct the interview well, they may question whether they want to work for your organization. So let's
Yeah.
start with some mistakes that are pretty common for new interviewers and things that everyone can avoid.
Okay. So let's start talking. Well, let's start with the big one, right? Over relying on your gut feeling, right? So as a candidate, as an interviewer, as a recruiter, you have to rely on the information that the candidate is giving you, right? And that information, obviously, you have to decide whether that's it's a credible information or not. But you cannot over rely on your gut feeling. Now, Pete, I am going to say this, right? My gut feeling almost 100% of the time is correct, but I can rely on it. I need the documentation to back it up. So always, always, always make a decision and rely on the documentation information that the candidate gives you to make a decision for that candidate. So gut feelings is not a good reason to hire or not hire somebody.
I agree with you there. I agree with you there. Let's go on to another one then. How about bias? Now that word, and we've probably talked about this on air before, but that word is usually a negative. I don't want to just focus on that. I want to talk about discrimination. And
Okay.
I'm going to let you you do most of the talking in this section because you are our HR professional. Uh, can you separate bias from discrimination just briefly?
Correct. So discrimination is what the law has determined what is illegal or not illegal. Now, so let me pause for a quick. The word discrimination sounds bad, right? As a recruiter, though, right, our job is to decide who is the right person for the role or not. Where discrimination comes into play, when the law comes into play, is whether we do it legally or not, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're interviewing 10 people, you only need 5. There's 5 people who are not going to get that job. So we just made a determination based on those attributes. But when the bias comes in, and I keep saying it because it sounds like my last name, is when you hire somebody based on your previous experience, whether you hire somebody you like and they don't have the proper credentials to do the job, or you have somebody who has the credentials to do the job, you just don't like them. That bias does not need to be included in that deciding factor. And the discrimination piece, what it does, it guides you to help you not to ask illegal questions. And Pete, it's very easy to fall into that trap, right? I'll give you a great example. One of the things that I do to coach interviewers is to create an environment where the candidate is comfortable, right? So you do some chit chat, right? They come in, how was traffic? How was this? What about that game last night? You start asking those kinds of questions. The more comfortable they get, those are breeding grounds for questions you should not be asking, right? Because next thing you know, you could be asking, "Wow, I see here you went to Puerto Rico. Are you from there? Is that how you learn Spanish? When did you graduate high school?" You're going to fall into a lot of different traps that we have to look into.
So it's safe to say then, as a way of thinking about it, that just because it's a question that's appropriate in the outside world, if you meet someone in your personal life, doesn't mean that it's okay in your private life. Or I'm sorry, it doesn't mean that it's okay professionally in an interview setting specifically.
That is correct. And folks, at the end of the day, as the interviewer, if you ask non-relevant questions, and the person does not get the job, you're giving that person some kind of credibility in whatever idea they may have into they didn't get the job because of the illegal questions that were asked. Right. So it's you just have to make sure that you stop yourself, you prevent yourself in that organization to fall into that trap.
So we won't talk too much about what those questions are right now. We'll link to the EEOC's website that spells it out very clearly. And there's
Such a great read, by the way.
yeah, and well, there's some little videos on there
Yeah.
that will help, and it's really easy to understand what the protected classes are and what you need to avoid. But Ricky, we can discriminate against some things, can't we? We can be biased against some things, can we not? Like, how about laziness? Can we be biased against that?
Absolutely. Somebody comes in, right, and they just don't care about the job. Everything they say just tells you they're lazy, right? Absolutely, I'm not going to hire that person, right? That person is not going to be on my team. And if again somebody comes in and they show you that they do just enough not to get fired, it's not somebody that I want on my team, and I'm just not going to hire them, right? And they can call. I mean, some people may call that discrimination, and I mean, I'm going to go on a limb and say, yeah, it just happens to be legal.
That's right. That's right.
Right? Yeah.
And you have to know the difference. That's really what
Right.
this is about. And that comes down to preparation. So let's move on to talk about that a little bit, because employers shouldn't throw someone into the fire who isn't prepared, who hasn't had that exposure to the EEOC guidelines, because it's an easy mistake to make with good intentions. You described a perfect scenario. You're talking about where you were from the weekend. I know you recently traveled to Puerto Rico. I know you're from there. If I ask you too many questions about that, it may be innocent and it may be appropriate again in our personal lives, but I might get in trouble for that. I could very well get in trouble for that. So we have to prepare to avoid those things. That's the best
Yeah.
way for it not to happen.
Well, and also it's just because it's the organization thinks they're doing something good, it doesn't mean it's not against the law. So let me give you a quick example, Pete. Years ago, I was doing I was helping an organization do an interview. They wanted to hire a forklift driver. I was on the panel with three other interviewers. This forklift driver candidate came in. It was obvious she was pregnant, right? It was very obvious. The hiring manager next to me, as soon as he saw, no, you know what? We're not going to do this. And I'm looking at him and I kicked him so hard under the desk, right? Because he did not want to interview her because she was pregnant. And the rationale he gave is like, Ricky, I don't want her to get hurt, right? I don't want her or the baby to get, this is a tough job. And what I'm telling him is that's irrelevant. That is an illegal reason not to continue with the interview process. Now, his heart was in the right place because he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. Nonetheless, still an illegal thing to do. Oh, trust me, we finished that interview. She got hired because she was the best candidate for that role. Right. So those are the things that we have to be careful with as hiring authorities.
So what else can you do to prepare for an interview? So we have to make sure those things are in place and you have to have the knowledge as the interviewer. What about understanding the job description? Right now, in this scenario you just gave, the person understood that there was some physical risk associated with it. But I think a lot of times a common candidate complaint that I have is the interview takes place, or a common complaint that I hear rather, the interview takes place and the interviewer is unprepared to really understand what the job is about and what they should be asking about in terms of qualifying the individual who's there to interview for it. That's a terrible experience to go through for that candidate.
So correct. So it for me, what I'm thinking about is a candidate experience. I prepared. I drove the actual routes. I bothered my neighbor to help me interview and videotape me. I went and got my power suit. I prepared. I get to the interview early. I did everything right, and the person is 5 minutes late to the interview. You can still see the sub stains on their shirt because they just finished eating lunch. They're reviewing the resume. It looks unprepared, and from my perspective, from the candidate's perspective, I start thinking this is their best foot forward, and this is how they're coming across, folks. You have to be careful what type of culture you project. So what do? If you know you have an interview at 12 noon, that means way before 12 noon, you should review the resume, know who's coming in, already have comments and questions on different parts of the resume that you have questions on. So reviewing the resume at the beginning of the interview, it's just not a good look. You want to come across that you've done this before, you prep for it, and you're ready for action. That tells the candidate this organization has their stuff together.
So know the job, know the candidate, and then know what you're going to ask. That's the next thing. Have a strategy for the interview, whether you're alone or with a group. Don't rely on others if you're in a group. Plan ahead of time, have a meeting about it, have a conversation, and be organized. That's really what we're talking about. And that's what preparation is. And if you are prepared, it'll go smoothly. You'll really be in position to get to come away with a very good assessment of whether the candidate's a good fit. And that's the objective ultimately of the time that you're spending.
That's right. Just train ahead of time. And look, I get it. We're busy. I completely understand, right? Because if you're in especially right now, Pete, a lot of organizations are short staffed at the bottom of the barrel and in the middle of the barrel, right? So you have a middle line manager who's like, oh God, not only do I not have enough time in the week to do my job, now I got to interview 5 people. We completely get it. You've got to make time. You have to make time because your lack of resources really isn't the candidate's problem, right? And the candidate shouldn't suffer because of that.
And the
You've
candidate
got to make the time.
The candidate will know. They'll sense it. They'll sniff it out, and it's going to be very obvious. And just don't put anyone through that. It's easily avoided.
And candidates today have options. Just saying.
They do, and they'll consider that in terms of whether they want to move forward. So let's move on to another section. Now, this one's particularly interesting to me because I've always liked to approach interviews in an unstructured way.
Okay.
Maybe that's the professional salesperson in me just can't get away from letting the conversation guide the path that I go down. That's always how I've approached sales, where I'm listening and then responding. But that's very different than a structured interview. And there's pros and cons to both. Talk about that for a second. How dangerous is an unstructured interview? Given everything we just talked about in terms of preparation, um, I'm always prepared, but I like to let the conversation take its own course.
Me too. And so yeah, this could be a whole different show there, Pete, because I have a lot to say about this one. So let's talk about unstructured interviews, right? That means that you don't have a set of questions. You just go with the conversation. And the danger in that is that you run the risk of asking one person a different set of questions than a different person. So how can you possibly make a decision on the skill set needed for the job if you're asking different questions to get different answers, right? So it's the best thing to do is to make sure you have the same set of questions for every candidate that comes across. Now, obviously, I don't want the set of questions to dominate the conversation, because if the candidate says something that's really exciting and you want to go down that road, definitely do so. But at the very least, you got to make sure the core questions remain the same.
So
Now,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was going to say, now, you're asking somebody who's unconventional in how he does interviews, because I do not like to conduct interviews in the office, Pete, at all. I do not. I like to go somewhere where the candidate is comfortable. So I like to go to Chili's, right? I go to Chili's. Back when I did this back in the past, we used to always go to Chili's. My boss was always upset because my P card was through the roof whenever it was interview season. But here's the thing, from a hiring authority's perspective, if you create an environment that the candidate is really comfortable, you're going to get some amazing pieces of information because they're comfortable. They'll tell you exactly what they're excited about. More importantly, they tell you what they don't like. And sometimes they do it in a way that you're like, I'm glad I'm finding this out now than 6 months down the road, so I can make a decision now. So that's how I do it, but everybody's different.
Well, and that's not practical for every scenario too.
Correct.
We know that. I mean, it's ideal. It'd be great if we could sit on a couch, have a meal, just spend significant time together. But a lot of times the structure and the time restraints don't really allow for that. But for certain positions where it's a look, I mean, I'm just going to say this, some hires are more unique than others. So if you're hiring an executive level professional where there's very few candidates who are qualified, very few who could meet the criteria, that kind of investment of time is practical. But if you're hiring for 20 positions to fill a call center role, let's say, probably not going to take them all to Chili's.
Absolutely not. Just having a big job fair in the call center, like I've done in the past, and have a petting zoo, which I've done in the past.
Well, we don't necessarily recommend that, but
it
maybe on the weekend.
Yeah.
So once the interview takes place, talk about the right questions. And so we suggested everyone plan, but what does that mean really? There's so many different styles of interviewing and different routes you can go down. One of the things that I believe is of particular importance, and you just brought it up, which is why I wanted to talk about it next, is behavioral interview questions. How do you, just because someone looks good on paper doesn't mean they're going to be the right fit. So what's your thought on the importance of those?
So I'm really careful in crafting my questions because I don't want to ask questions that are answered in yes or no. And I don't want to ask question in what would you do in this situation, because what would you do doesn't tell me what they've done in the past, right? The questions I like to ask is, tell me a time where ABC happened, and where ABC happened, what was your response, right? What did you do to that, and what was the outcome? That tells me the kind of an employee this person is going to be in the same scenario, same situation that they're going to experience here. So can people lie? Of course they can. But if you ask, tell me a time when you did A, B, and C, that gives you a more closer perspective into how he or she would handle that situation in your organization. So stay away from yes or no questions. Make sure that you ask questions, behavior questions of what they've done in the past. You're going to end up in a much better position to make a decision to hire the right person.
And that decision to hire the right person to me is it's such a meaningful phrase, because it's not about whether the person can do the job. It's not about whether they're qualified for the job. It's about whether they're going to be a good fit for the job in the company culture. And that's something that I was talking to my recruiting team earlier this morning about, where people will say recruiting is sales, and in many ways it is. I believe that, but not in the sense of trying to talk someone into doing something, try to talk someone into taking a job just because they can do it. It's about whether they will want to do it, whether they'll be happy and satisfied doing it, and whether the company will be happy and satisfied with them. And so that is as important as the skill set. Those soft skills really have to come out, and we have to make sure that desires align, right? What the
Yeah.
company desires and what the individual desires. And I think that gets lost too often. So it's something, in my opinion, it's very worthy of focusing on during the interview. Is let's see if we're really going to be a match, not just on the first day, but on day 100 and many days beyond that.
You said something in the past. I don't know if it was in this on this show or the other one that really caught my attention. You said that you almost try to talk people out of a job, right? You tell them everything about the job, everything about it, everything that happens, and if they're the good, bad, and the ugly, and if they're still like, you know what, I'm in, you got the right person, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, so caveat to that is I was
Yeah.
specifically talk about that in terms of hiring for recruiting and sales,
Mhm.
because it's a commission oriented job that, it can be a challenging job. Every job can be, but when people are your product, so to speak, you have to be a certain kind of person to withstand disappointment and frustration, and knowing that you're going to, if you just think of recruiting, if you call a candidate, if you see 100 resumes that you've sourced and you call 100 candidates for one job opening, that means 99 aren't going to get the job.
Yeah.
Some, significant percentage is probably not going to call you back. Some who do pick up the phone aren't going to be necessarily friendly and accommodating to why you're calling. And so recruiting and a sales job, and everyone knows this about sales, but recruiting is the same way. It's not for the faint of heart. And
No, it's
so,
not.
yes, when we're hiring for a role like that, I do try to talk people out of the job. But it brings up an interesting thing that I read the other day. Someone posted on LinkedIn. I don't know. It wasn't someone I know, or I probably would have called and talked to him about it. But they said, let's get away from excluding candidates. Let's try to rule in candidates. And I thought, no, 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 that is not how you should recruit.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
It sounds nice, right? Rainbows and puppy dog tails, whatever, right? And butterflies. I mean, all that sounds nice, like a Disney movie. But the reality is, you have to look for the things that aren't on the surface. That's what a good recruiter or interviewer can do. Is let's not just share all the positive. Let's make sure this is going to be, like I said, a good fit on day 100, just like we think it is on day one. And so you have to get underneath the surface to really have those conversations. That's taking us a little off topic for today,
No,
but
is it? But
it,
I
it,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I just it's okay, and I would say it's necessary even to talk about the downside of a job. If you only say, "Here's all the good," right? Let me just give you our good traits. Well, we don't want to be surprised with bad news later. So, I'm a big believer that bad news early is good news.
Mhm.
Same thing applies in the interview process.
I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial. I think if you don't give the good, the bad, and the ugly, you're gonna run the risk of dealing with people who will have an issue with that 6 months down the road after you spend a lot of money to onboard them and train them. Might as well take care of that at the very beginning. One more thing I want to say. I know that we have to move on because this crafting the question piece is crucial. It's crucial. And here's another area. Depending on the nature of the job, you may have to ask some questions that on the face, on the surface, may sound illegal. A great example. We talked about it earlier how you can fall into a trap. If I just went to Puerto Rico, is that how I learned how to speak Spanish? What happens if you do have a position that one of the skill set is that you know that you have to know Spanish? Do not make an assumption whether somebody knows Spanish or not because of their last name. Do not make an assumption because of that. You have to ask in a specific manner. Don't say, oh, You lived in Puerto Rico, so you have to know Spanish. You lived in the Dominican Republic, you have to know Spanish. No, you ask everybody. One of the main things for this job is you have to be proficient to speak and write Spanish. Is that something you can do? That's it. That's it. And if they say yes, you go forward. If they say no, if that's a knockout question, then you're going to have to make a left there. But you have to partner with human resources to make sure that the right questions are asked for the right positions.
Consistent with everything we've said so far,
That's
right?
right.
Make
Yes,
sure
sir.
you know what's allowed and what's not. That is step one prior to any of these deeper level things, for sure. But let's move on. Go to
Yes.
another one. Let's talk about active listening a little bit, responding and reacting to what the candidate says. Don't be a robot. I don't want to dwell on this one too much, but a good interviewer listens and responds. They don't just have a canned set of questions. And you may need to change your course a little bit during the interview conversation.
I'm a firm believer, Pete, that in an interview, once you do the introductions and you explain what the job is all about, anything after that, 80% of the conversation should be coming from the candidate and 20% should be coming from the hiring authority. I mean, I'm a big believer in that. Do you share that same sentiment or do you have a different ratio?
I do. I mean, I certainly at the beginning of the interview, I want to hear from the candidate because once you start talking as the interviewer, that's going to skew the conversation and the answers that would have otherwise come from the candidate. You want those to be natural. So you don't want to say early in the interview, we look for people who think ABC and or act ABC in every scenario, whatever that might be. We look for aggressive people, or we look for people who are um, who love working as a team, for example, right? And then if someone who likes being autonomous and really likes solo work, if they hear the interviewer say up front, we are looking for people who want to be part of a team and how they spend their day. If they need the job, they'll say that, even if they don't mean it. So
Yeah.
planting thoughts in the candidate's head is just a bad idea. It won't leave to genuine, open, honest answers. Not because the candidate intended to give answers that weren't genuine. It's because you told them that's what you were looking for, and so of course they're going to tell you what you want to hear, or they you know, I mean, they may just get up and walk out. I mean, but very few people do that, I've discovered. So let the candidate do the talking. And then at the end, if you are concerned about something as the interviewer, or in my case, as we just were talking about, if I want to try to talk someone out of something because I've sensed that they may not be a good fit from their words, then I will press down on those things
Yep.
at the end. But yes, 100%. Let them do
Yep.
the talking up front.
That's right. Okay. So we're on the same page. Awesome.
We usually are on this stuff,
Yeah,
right?
we
I
are. That's
mean,
true.
when it comes to interviewing, it's there's a certain set of guidelines that are almost universal in nature. I mean, there's extremes and there's unique things for every job. How you'd interview someone to play in the NFL is different than how you'd interview someone to work in a call center.
Yep.
But in the business world, these things almost always are universally applicable. So let's move on to another section and briefly talk about culture fit and the importance of that. I think we did already, but it's kind of on the list that we want to make sure that we do talk about the importance of identifying soft skills. So was there anything we missed there, Ricky?
No, it's to be honest, Pete, I get a lot of pushback on this one because I'm a firm believer in hiring for attitude, right? So to me, if the person meets the minimum criteria of what the job requires, but they have the right attitude for the job, absolutely I'm going to go with that person versus somebody who's just sticking the mud, for a lack of better term. So yes, you have to assess for soft skills and make sure you have a good cultural fit, because not only do you have to hire the right person for the organization, you have to hire the right person to mesh with the rest of the team they're going to be working with. So
Yeah, I mean
that is an important thing to take into account.
it absolutely is. I mean, the organization is the individuals, right? So
Yep.
it's not the company brand, the company name. It's those other people you're going to work with. I mean, it doesn't matter who works for ABC company if they work in Europe and you never engage with the team in Europe. It matters who you're working with locally as part of your day to day life. So yeah, I think that's as important as anything else in an interview for the candidate's perspective is, are they going to be happy with the people they have to interact with every day.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, just get along in a way that's respectful, and there's healthy conflict, because you do want that. You don't want to avoid all conflict, but they do it in a way that it adds value to the culture of the organization, and at the end of the day, it adds value to what you're selling, whether it's a product or a service, because at the end of the day, we are a for-profit organization. Most of organizations are. So
So you've conducted the interview,
mhm.
you've closed, right? What happens next? If you're, sometimes an individual will make a decision by themselves. They'll have complete autonomy, but a lot of times there's others involved. I would say the vast majority of the time, in my experience, at least one other person, if not more, gets to weigh in on a candidate, maybe has to approve a hire. What thoughts do you have on what should happen post interview?
So post interview, I'm a firm believer, Pete, in letting the candidate know what to expect from beginning to end. That way, they are not lost in the process. 9 times out of 10, in an interview process, everybody knows what's going to happen next, except one person, the candidate. So we need to let that person know what is to be expected. And you know what? Whether they get the job or not, I think it's really important to ask the candidate about the process. How did the process go? Do you have any feedback from the process? Because you, as a hiring authority, you're seeing this from the hiring authority's perspective. That same situation is being processed by somebody from a different point of view, and they have really good information to make your process just that much better. So I suggest you should have some kind of a process to ask for feedback, and you implement that feedback. So ask for feedback, have some reflection, and let the candidate know what to expect next.
I was just thinking about panel interviews the other day because we published a blog about it, the pros and cons. And one thing that I like about panel interviews is now there's a lot to not like about panel interviews, especially from the candidate's perspective, right? Most aren't fans. But what it does for me is it forces the ability to hear the perspective of a peer, a colleague, someone from a different department, someone from a different level within the organization, because we all we all hear the same things, but the way we interpret it is different. You might see different body language, and when you're actively engaged in a conversation like you and I are right now, it's different than when you're witnessing other people be engaged in a conversation. So you get to hear something different, right? I'm thinking about what you're saying. I'm also having to think about how I'm going to respond versus just being an independent observer. And when I hear other people ask questions in a panel interview that I'm part of, it a lot of times it's questions I wouldn't have thought to ask. They hear something I missed. So there's a lot of value there. And it's not surprising to me anymore, but perhaps to those who haven't been through a lot of interviews, a surprising amount of time, one person may love a candidate, the other person may have a
Yeah.
lot of reasons not to like them at all, even though they were exposed to the same information.
So that is when you get everybody together and you have honest heart to heart conversations on why you didn't like that person, why you did like that person. Because yes, I agree with you, Pete. Panel interviews, I get just the same amount of information to hire a candidate or not hire a candidate from my peers on the panel interview than the actual candidate. Because you're right, the person to my left or to my right may have seen something I didn't see. So that's why I love panel interviews, for that very same reason.
Yeah, and it's a great way for young interviewers to be exposed, or new interviewers anyway, to be exposed to those with more experience, where they have the ability to learn. Because interview training is something that should be ongoing, right? I mean,
Yes.
I can't think of any examples. I probably shouldn't say them. If I do, off the top of my head, that things that were acceptable in an interview 30 years ago that aren't acceptable now. But I bet there's a pretty long list. So if you're not trying to continue to improve and be part of learning and evolving, it might create a different kind of problem. So even though really this interview training show that we're doing today is about, we kind of by default think of new employees, young professionals. Sometimes it's just as important, if not even more important, to older professionals who are more set in their ways.
Well, it's Pete. It's something that I believe should be done on an annual basis, because now the way technology is evolving, the way the work culture is evolving, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. you don't get to see everything just by working, right? You have to conduct training. And who knows, maybe as a result of this podcast, Pete, you and I will do a webinar on this, right? To let everybody know exactly what needs to happen. I've done this in the past and it works, but it's there are different things that are happening in the world today that just never existed 5, 6 years ago. So it's crucial to conduct training on an annual basis to make sure you're, number one, your recruiters and your hiring authorities are representing your brand in the light in which the culture it's supposed to be with that brand. That's crucial. And number two, you don't get sued, right? It's really easy for that to happen these days. So
That's right. That's
represent your
step
brand and don't
one.
get sued. Yeah.
Step one, don't get sued.
Well, I mean, correct.
Do
Yeah.
everything else. But no,
I got it backwards.
well, no, I think you're right. I mean, you know, in a sense, you do have to have the big, you know, elephant in the room, so to speak, of any kind of legal issue. But we know that there's a ripple effect that takes
Yeah.
place of every interaction. And you're someone who is such a big believer in onboarding and how that process starts from the moment you engage with a candidate. And I think you're 100% right about that. But a lot of times the interview is not going to go well. If you interview more than one person for one opening, someone's going to be disappointed. Someone's going to have to be told they didn't get the job. And if you didn't treat that individual well, intentionally or otherwise, it's going to have a ripple effect and it's going to damage the company's reputation.
And you know, and not only that, Pete, let's talk about the hiring authorities' energy, right? Because if you interview somebody, let's say you're interviewing 5 people in one day, I guarantee your energy, your enthusiasm on interview number 1 might be a little bit different than interview number 5, right? So we got to make sure that it's that you give the same energy with all interviews as you do as the first interview. And it's hard to do, but it's not impossible to do. You just have to work a little bit more. I don't know, go to Starbucks after lunch, right? Do whatever you need to do to get that caffeine up, to make sure you are showing every candidate the same enthusiasm. That you normally would show for the first candidate.
That's such. I'm really glad you made that point because it's so important that even though it may be your 10th interview, it's the candidate's first.
That's right.
That 10th candidate is doing it for the first time. And if you can't show that, even if you feel it, and we all know what that feels like, the thought that I don't want to go do this. I've done it 10 times and it's real.
It's
I mean,
real.
the struggle is real, so to speak, but you have to put on a different face. You have to stop and bring that enthusiasm. And that's a word that I use a lot. It's a word that I have great belief in terms of uh, success and how someone is perceived. Enthusiasm, and I certainly look for that in candidates. Well, I should have the same enthusiasm when I'm interviewing because they took the time to be there. It's a huge thing in someone's life. Of course, we have to take that seriously and give it the respect it deserves. And
Right.
you know, bring your best. That you're obligated to do that as an interviewer.
That's right. And look, if you are a leader right now listening to this and you have recruiters that are exposed to all these candidates and all these situations that we're talking about, again, get them the training. Send them this podcast, right? Send them this podcast. Make sure they listen to it because, folks, it is really easy to step on a landmine, and we are here to make sure you navigate through those and make sure you hire the best people for your organization. Trust me on that. I will die on that hill.
Well, let's close on that hill too,
Okay.
because I think that's a perfect way to do it. Ricky, we do owe a follow up, I think, on what happens to the candidates who aren't selected, how you present offers. That's its own show, post interview. So we'll do that later. But next week, Ricky, I think we're due for Q&A. We have questions piling up. We keep saying we're going to do it and haven't done it yet. So
Okay.
can we commit right now, next week, Q&A session?
Roger that. I will be in town. I will be in the studio. Absolutely. That is going to happen.
I love the new look. The studio's looking
Right?
good.
Yeah, look at this. Look at this. It's nice.
It's wonderful. I won't ask you to go back and sit in the chair, but it looks great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So let's do that. If you want to throw in another question, we have room for more. We always like getting them. We'll pick the best ones. It is hire calling, HIRE calling at fourcornerresources.com. we'd love to hear from you on any suggestions you have for the show. So thanks for joining, and this has been a fun conversation as always, Ricky. Hopefully, we help some folks out there improve their interview process.
I'm sure we did, and make sure you tune in for next week. We are going to have that Q&A. Keep your eyes open. We might have that leadership, that recruitment training, interviewing training coming up pretty soon.
All right, stay tuned. Have a great rest of the day.